Well, again, a different world, the relationship people had with wrestling when it was a weekly thing. That kind of sets us up for our next question here, Jim. This one was sent via the Cult of Cornette Facebook group by Tony Felice. At what point in wrestling history did promoters decide to start booking weekly towns? Was the demand for weekly events already existing, or was that demand created via promotion, TV, newspapers, etc.? Why was the weekly town concept limited primarily to southern territories, while the Northeast and AWA territories opted for monthly shows?
Well, it's nothing new, and it wasn't caused by the TV revolution or modern communications or whatever. Louisville was oftentimes, there were some interruptions, but oftentimes was a weekly town in the 30s. In short version, the reason why that there's a kind of a southern or even a southwestern and northern break in that and midwestern is because the bigger cities, the buildings cost more to rent and the expenses were more for promotion and etc. Even the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles, big city, but they ran every week because the fucking building was there and it was dedicated for the most part to boxing and wrestling. But if you got Madison Square Garden, even if there was in the hottest periods of the Garden in the 50s under Rocca and Perez, you wouldn't have been able to put 20,000 people in there every week, even though they were doing it maybe every 3 weeks or once a month, and the expenses would quadruple. But by the same token, in the southern markets, the southern towns, the buildings were usually smaller. And especially in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, before the major sports arenas began being built, wrestling was a more popular professional sport in the 30s and 40s than, and certainly more profitable for the participants, as we've been talking about. The wrestlers made more money than football players did in the NFL or the baseball players, et cetera, unless you were Mickey Mantle. But there weren't that many sports arenas. So the southern towns would go weekly and try to get the same 3,000 people there, more or less thereabouts, to come every week. And we've talked about that the biggest arena in the state of Kentucky until the 50s was the Armory, Louisville Gardens, that seated in those days like tops out at 9,000 people for boxing and wrestling. And it wasn't until they built the Memorial Gym in Lexington and then Freedom Hall in 1957 here that there was a arena in the state that seated over 10,000 people. So that's why a lot of times and the same thing in Dallas, the Sportatorium, but they owned the fucking building, right? You established, there's geographically all over the country, there have been weekly towns in any area, but it would generally be a smaller building in the metropolitan area of a bigger city. And Brian, we're going to talk about stuff I learned at the Pfeffer collection of how even when they weren't running Madison Square Garden in New York in that period in the 40s, they were running 5 or 6 nights a week live wrestling events in the metropolitan area. Just smaller buildings, but they were running weekly. So that was the trade-off you made. Vern didn't want to run the smallest building in Minneapolis once a week. When he got bigger, he wanted to run the big building once a month. And that's the same thing that happened in Atlanta. The City Auditorium seated 6,000 or 7,000, cheap rent every Friday night. Boom. Once the auditoriums closed, they couldn't rent the Omni every fucking week. And that's what started leading to the downfall of Atlanta business when the only option they had was an 18,000 seat modern arena that they had to run once a month. Does that kind of give the people an idea of what it's not a rule of thumb? You could go anywhere, but the weekly towns were generally mid-sized markets and mid-sized buildings and relying on regular clientele to where if you had Knoxville, Tennessee, or Nashville, Tennessee, or Louisville, Kentucky that would sell 150 to 200,000 tickets a year, there was, a major linchpin in your territory.